Landscape Futures is really a project that's coming out of Bandelier National Monument, and they're looking at their landscape 5 years after the 2011 Las Conchas fire and asking what to do next and how to manage some of their altered ecosystems. And so Jeremy Sweat, the Chief of Resources at Bandelier National Monument, has contracted with the Landscape Conservation Initiative with Sasha Stortz and Carrie Kimball, and we're working with him at the field station to create a project that we called the East Jemez Landscape Futures, in a nod to some of the uncertainty both on the social and the ecological side. So moving into it, again, just thanking the partners for this. So Bandelier has been the main driver and funder of this project, and then the Landscape Conservation Initiative has done a lot of the heavy lifting. They're out of Flagstaff. So for those of you, just to kind of ground this in place, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Jemez Mountains, but just in case you're not, we're looking just west of Santa Fe, Bandelier again at the center, and for the East Jemez, we're kind of looking at this area here with an area that's been affected by fire, drought, and post-fire flooding. So the eastern flanks of the Jemez Mountains down onto the Pajarito Plateau. And then fire, of course, has been kind of the big driver of a lot of these landscape changes and the obvious one. And so here is just looking at the high severity, the tree-killing fire in the eastern Jemez. Again, Bandelier is outlined there in white. And this is the tree-killing fire, the anomalous stuff. We know from tree ring records that these areas didn't see much of this type of high severity fire, and certainly not at this patch size and scale. And what you have, and again, this is known to a lot of you, is after these big fires, you get these areas that look pretty stark immediately after. This is taken in 2011. But then a couple years later, you get these recoveries in this system. And this is a shrub field here, oak and locust, with some herbaceous coming in. So maybe not trees, but still life in these places. And in a lot of areas, it's actually pretty diverse. There's a habitat mosaic with some existing conifers surviving in certain places, and then more shrubs and grasses in others. So the disturbance that always kind of follows these in the Southwest, these major fires, is floods. And these are the pieces that are actually, in some cases we can really use the word devastating. They're turning little trickles of creeks into massive roaring rivers and causing a lot of damage in these canyon bottoms that historically have been pretty diverse. Been pretty diverse areas biologically, and they're essentially reducing the diversity to near zero in some places, moving huge amounts of debris down with them and kind of causing cascading problems. So this is a view of Capulan Canyon, just at the mouth of Capulan Canyon where it flows into the Rio Grande, and you can see all the sediment that's moved down. And historically, this place would have been a pretty kind of a neat, diverse wetland with lots of things, growing in that area, not just a big sandy beach. And then, of course, there's a human toll with these floods. And so this is a picture from the visitor center at Bandelier, but, of course, a lot of communities and homes and other kind of values are downstream of these, of the canyons. And the third biggest disturbance is drought, right? So drought is it's this thing that always lurks in the background of the Southwest, and it's widespread. We're looking into the future at maybe potentially some hotter, more frequent droughts. Their impacts are overarching, and so you put them on top of on top of the fire and the floods. And so this area burned in Las Conchas in 2011, so right after the fire you can see a little bit of grass coming in, but still a lot of ash in the area. And it recovered in what was a really dry period. So this is that same area in 2013. So again, 2011, 12, and 13 were really dry in the Jemez. And in 16, we finally started to get some noticeable recovery. So what we see kind of as we think about this from the 100,000-foot view, people have started to think, how are these disturbances changing, and what does that mean for kind of the future of these ecosystems? And Jill Johnstone and others published a paper last year that I thought was particularly interesting on this concept, looking at how the disturbance regime here in this top box, the red cube is kind of the disturbance regime, and then the blue cube is the way that the ecosystem has adapted to the disturbances. And on the left, they show this kind of alignment with disturbance in the ecological properties, and on the right, they show this kind of divergence. And so definitely in the Southwest, we're getting into some of this divergence between what the ecosystem is adapted to and the disturbance that we're seeing. So these anomalous high severity fires definitely separating those two things, and it makes the system really hard to recover from. And so down on the bottom box shows the kind of typical, the ball and cup thing that we've all seen a bunch of times. And here they're just demonstrating that climate change on the right-hand side will make it easier for these things to flip over into different, cross thresholds easier. And this is a diagram from a paper that Don Falks has published, and it shows a similar kind of thing where these ecosystems are operating around in this kind of environmental space that has disturbance built into it, but that some disturbances, anomalous disturbances especially, can push these systems over thresholds where then they're operating in a different environmental space with different disturbance regimes. And here he's demonstrated that with some arrows, and then Craig Allen, of course, has demonstrated this here with more arrows, which just kind of indicates the complexity, I think, of these systems. So within all of those disturbances, there's multiple scales and there's multiple kind of interactions between these disturbances. And so thinking about that kind of theoretically is good, and but pulling out some empirical data, I think, is helpful for this context. So this is something Jonathan Koop published last year, looking at reburns in the Lost Conscious fire, or areas that have reburned during Lost Conscious, and it just shows again that things are moving away from forests into grasslands, shrublands, or just this kind of in between space. And all the arrows, if you look at them, are pointing away from forests. So just empirically, we kind of see this on the ground in the Eastern Jemez, and a lot of this stuff is being driven, as we know, by climate. And this work from Park Williams, which I'm sure everybody has seen too many times, but it just, to me, it sends the point home that these disturbances are going to become more common in the future. These kind of severe things that feel anomalous now are going to be less so. And I think it's always important to remember that, people are at the other end of these disturbances a lot of times. And so when, we've pushed nature, we've stressed it out to the point where it's pushing back. And unfortunately, that's not always good for us, and that has, that has negative consequences to human beings. And I think that in those negative, with those negative impacts, there are opportunities to kind of come together and try to solve the problem. And I think that the Southwest Fire Science Consortium is a great venue for that. And so here's a field trip that we did with the JFSC board, and Xander was part of it. And so it was just a great opportunity to get people out in the field and talk about potential solutions to these, to these big challenges. And I think that there's a lot of great opportunities. And this is just a picture of, half a dozen young people with looking, I like this picture for some reason. I'm drawn to it, but it's young people looking forward, chainsaws working hard, getting out there in the woods, trying to make a little bit of money and make a difference. And so I think that those kind of fundamental properties still exist, and those fundamental opportunities still exist even in these areas that have been impacted by severe disturbances. But they're definitely not without their challenges and not without, and especially when you start to think about these in the context of linked human and natural systems, which we're all starting to do. We're all starting to think more at a landscape scale. We're all starting to think about how do these landscapes impact people? How can we make things work for both people and the environment? And I think that a lot of folks, again, thinking at this 100,000 foot level are debating this, and they're thinking about these things in different kind of ways. And, you know, whether or not you call them novel ecosystems or degraded or altered or whatever, I think that the reality is on the ground, we've actually got to start doing things. And so people kind of coming down to maybe the 30,000 foot view are talking about ways to adapt to climate change and adapt to these kind of changing disturbance regimes. And so the one paper here I'll point out, especially is this one by Nate Stevenson. If you haven't had a chance to read that, that's a great essay on natural resource management in the Park Service with, you know, climate change impacts on the horizon. So the social side of things, I think, has been really important to us in the East Jemez Landscape Futures, and really thinking about how these disturbances and how these altered landscapes impact people and how people can be a part of the restoration is really important. So now trying to get down to the ground level on some of this thinking, we look for examples of how other people do this. And we pulled this one out, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce the country name there, but it's an Aboriginal land management plan from Australia. And they looked at how do we, you know, adapt to climate change? How are we going to do land management for the next 50 years? And the thing they started with was, how do we make sure that we preserve our culture? How do we make sure that the things that we value socially and societally are, you know, out on the landscape, and those are the places that we need to start. So I thought that was a really interesting take on land management and an interesting platform to move on from. And we have a little bit of experience with that the consortium was a big part of the Fires of Change exhibit and some other fire science and art. And what we learned, well, one of the things that we learned through that process was that art can be a really great conduit between science management and the community. And in Fires of Change, we used art to explain kind of how we do fire management, how we know about, like, how we learn about fire ecology and that kind of stuff to the community. And with the East Jemez Landscape Futures project, we really want to use art as, you know, turn the pipes around, so to speak, and have the community kind of tell land managers and tell researchers what their concern is, similar to the project in Australia, where they kind of started with culture. And so we're doing a little bit of a hybrid thing where we're still going to be doing a lot of the natural resource management in a classic kind of way, but we also want to bring in art and story into this project. And I'll get into that in a few minutes. So diving into our project, the East Jemez Landscape Futures, the purpose, again, was all driven from Bandelier. And this is to really take a collaborative approach, a landscape level approach, look at addressing uncertainties through a network of land managers, scientists, NGOs, again, across boundaries. This is something that was stressed. We don't want to duplicate efforts. A lot of people on the East Jemez, on the eastern side of the Jemez, are already doing things. So we want to learn from what they've been doing, duplicate the things that work, try to fix the things that don't work as well. And then again, at the end, you know, all through the process, we really want to make sure that we're capturing these stories from individuals so that we can incorporate that into the land management plan, especially given the amount of uncertainty that these landscapes present. So we started off it's just a needs assessment, get out on the ground, try to figure out what people want to do, what people are doing, and just map out kind of the lay of the land. This was led by Sasha Stortz out of the Landscape Conservation Initiative and Carrie Kimball. And so we finished this up in May of 2017. It's on our website, eastjemez.org. It's about 50 pages, but a lot of that is in 2 appendices. So the first 10 pages are kind of the meat of it. So you can get through it pretty quickly. The bulk of, the needs assessment was conducted by interviewing 23 different organizations, 50 different people in interviews. Here's a sampling of some of the folks that we interviewed, some of the organizations. The needs assessment really dives into the nuts and bolts of how it was conducted. If you're interested in that, I would point you to the document. If you're interested in kind of specific takeaways and specific points, those appendices are really lined out nicely for you to dive into your favorite kind of place. The overall results from the needs assessment, the overall goals were just, again, to identify the information needs, the management issues, what people were doing already, and where opportunities existed for creating new collaborations, and just try to meet more people and figure out who else should be involved. And we kind of walked into this this is a question that somebody, they reframed our needs assessment approach by sort of saying, you guys are kind of asking the question, what do we do after the end of the world? And I think it feels like that to a lot of people, especially people who have had a long and deep ties to the East Jemez. I think this is a pretty, emotionally and just even physically, sometimes these are hard things to deal with. And so I think it does feel like the end of the world to some people. And we really were asking the question, are there opportunities to conduct these kind of coordinated research and management in these severely altered landscapes? And the answer is yes, 100% yes. And it's not the end of the world. It just feels like that, and there are things that we can do moving forward. And so out of this needs assessment process, we identified 3 major areas of potential active engagement. And one is the canyon bottoms. And again, this is going back to these areas that used to be these linear strips of diverse biodiverse areas, and they really got hammered by both fire and floods. And so one of the things that people identified was a interest and a need to protect the areas that are less disturbed, to slow that water and erosion, to kind of reset those processes onto a more natural kind of, hydrologic flow pattern. Make sure that we're, again, protecting the areas that do exist, and then working on restoration, especially native fish restoration, came up a lot of times. And I think that people were often saying, let's do some native fish restoration, and that's kind of their primary focus. But other folks were really saying, if we can get the systems, and we can get the streams to a place where we can put native fish in and we can have a healthy population of fish, that means that we've kind of connected all the dots upstream and that everything is functioning well. It's a healthy system, and the fish will give us an indicator of that. There'll be an indicator of whether or not the system is working well. Another spot that people had pretty broad agreement on was protecting these Conifer Refugia. And by that, we just mean these potential seed sources that are out on the landscape that survive multiple fires and droughts, and protecting them for their genetic diversity, protecting them for, potential future kind of forest starts and places where forests can move out from. And, the first step in that is going to be identifying these. It sounds like a fairly trivial thing to do, but when you have a landscape when we're looking at a landscape the size of, 300,000 acres, it becomes a little bit more difficult just to go out and map these We have a few folks working on remote sensing projects to try to get us started, but it is going to take a pretty significant field component. And then there's great opportunities to study the genetics of these kind of forest refugia, and then use that information to build off of use these little refugia and little patches of surviving trees as a nucleus and kind of build out of that. And so a lot of that work Owen Burney's doing out of NMSU. And then the area with the highest level of uncertainty is definitely these spots that have been converted to shrubland or grassland. And so we see a lot of that on the East Jemez, of a lot of shrublands, a lot of grasslands kind of on the flatter stuff, and the shrubs are dominated more on the steeper slopes. But lots of uncertainty both about, how forests may recolonize those areas, regenerate in the grasslands and the shrublands, what the fire effects in those areas will be, how should, quote unquote, we be managing fire in those landscapes, and then where might it be best to kind of promote these new systems, as it's, potentially these are drought-resistant, disturbance-tolerant species. So I think the other really interesting kind of thing from a social perspective is just that the perceptions of whether or not these shrublands especially are fireproof is varied. And so it'd be interesting to kind of dig into that a little bit more and just kind of see what are the conditions that make those shrublands burn, and are we likely to run into those in the future. And lastly, just on the needs assessment, we had these overarching issues that came up, and one was really people were all over the board on this, but assisted migration. And some folks were really all about it, trying to make sure that we could support moving species from as far south as northern Mexico up to the Jemez. Other people were thinking of assisted migration as more just assisted dispersal out into these burned areas, maybe from a more southern latitude, but still in the Jemez, and so kind of smaller scale. And so that's definitely ripe for experimentation. Some of it's already ongoing, but again, another question that needs to be answered, both on the scientific side, but also on the cultural and the social side. So the other thing that I thought was really interesting and something that I think gets left out of a lot of the traditional land management is just this idea of planting culturally relevant plants. And so that would be things that the ancestral the Puebloans use for their ceremonies. And so thinking about how do we do restoration specifically with those plants to make sure that there's viable populations of those species, that the specific species that they use for forever, hopefully, but trying to think about that in the future. And just as a simple example, one of the things that a lot of the local Pueblos use is Doug fir boughs. And, if we want to try to make sure that we're thinking about how to create viable populations of Doug fir in the future, if we wanted to do something like outplanting Doug fir, we need to be thinking about that now and planting trees now in order for them to be viable in 30 or 50 years. Of course, invasive species and erosion and wildlife habitat and connectivity, those are always issues that come up in any landscape management plan. And I think that the uncertainty around those things in these altered areas is it's higher. And so I think there's, again, more opportunities here for experimentation and learning. And so I think overall, we really viewed this needs assessment as an effective process. I think that people were really interested in talking about a landscape or talking at a landscape scale, but they really were focused on a specific place. And everybody on the East Jemez, at least, seems to have a canyon that they prefer or a canyon that they manage, and and they're happy to think at the landscape scale and have it tied in and coordinated, but they're really going to be working at a kind of site-specific location. And I think that a lot of people told us, and which is great, that they felt that this was an inclusive process, and it needs to continue to move that way. And they really want to make sure that it's respectful of the cultural heritage. And for us, we were pushing to try to make sure that people were looking forward and thinking about what this landscape will look like in the next 30 to 50, 100 years from now. And so trying to push the envelope on the typical kind of land management plan time scale. So yeah, I think that the biggest challenge for sure, 100%, is capacity. And we recognize that right from the get-go, that the land managers, everybody on the landscape is already kind of maxed out in terms of time. And so if this process could be something either through grants or new projects to increase the capacity, to bring in more money, to bring in more staff, that's ideal. It's a huge challenge. It's going to be a challenge even to get people to carve out enough time to help with grant writing and project proposal writing and that kind of stuff. And so I think that's a challenge, and then and not unique to the East Jemez project. But I think the uncertainty that's associated with some of these landscapes is fairly unique to the East Jemez. All projects like this have uncertainty, but I think that the levels here are somewhat unprecedented. And just to be a lot of people were just blunt and honest with us, and they said, look, we have a lot of land to manage, even still in the Jemez Mountains, that has trees on it, and we're going to focus on the area that hasn't been burned and hasn't been severely impacted by these recent disturbances. And that's fair. I mean, I think that's part of the reality, but coming at it from the perspective of Bandelier or Santa Clara or some of the other stakeholders, you can tell that it is a priority for them. And so again, it's going to be kind of one of those partnership building things where if doing something on this landscape is a priority for you, we're going to need to work together to try to figure out how do you increase capacity for somebody else on the side where they may not view it as such a high priority. And so I think that all leads into a whole lot of opportunities. I see the opportunities way outweighing the challenges. And the number one opportunity is just this: there's infinite ways we can learn from this landscape. And I think that everything that we do out there should be framed as an experiment, and I think that these landscapes are going to be translatable to they're going to translate to different places in the West. Unfortunately, as we look forward, we're going to see more of these disturbances. We've already seen several every year. It seems like we see these big massive fires and drought, whether it's in Arizona and New Mexico or somewhere else in the West. And so I think that we have tons of opportunities to learn. And then we have a lot of opportunities to kind of change how we do climate change adaptation and change how we think about land management and incorporating in more cultural values and having that be a primary driver of some restoration activities rather than an add-on benefit to the bigger landscape scale kind of projects. And I do think that there are this is a great opportunity to kind of get to know your neighbor a little bit in the East Jemez. And folks, I think, have been responding to just the disturbance in front of them since Las Conchas in 2011, and now everybody's kind of got the opportunity to lift their head up and look around and see what else is going on. And so I think we're going to need to leverage the things that each other bring to the table if we're going to be successful. And then again, I think, just to emphasize it one more time, integrating that culture into integrating culture into land management planning is a super important part of this project, and it's something that I think that the Park Service is very interested in experimenting with, and a lot of the local communities that we talk to are interested in participating in that process. So one of the simplest way to kind of sum that up is during one of the interviews, an interviewee told us a story about how she went down in Frijoles Canyon, which is the main canyon in Bandelier, and went fishing with her family, as young family, just camping on the cheap, and they threw a line in and caught a trout, and then they hung the trout on the line and were going to eat it the next morning for breakfast, and went to bed, woke up, and a raccoon had eaten a fish, and so it's like raccoon wrecked breakfast. But that's a story that's folklore, right? It's in the family kind of every Christmas, they tell the same story, and they laugh about it, and they think about that time. And I think that's like, we can relate to that. We all have similar stories. And she said that was the magic of Frijoles Canyon. That's not there anymore. She doesn't see it there anymore. And so she says, how can you guys restore magic to the East Jemez? And I know that that's a nebulous phrase, and it's very broad and wide, but I think that it makes sense to us, and it's a good place to start from and to drill down into it. And so I don't anticipate Jeremy at Bandelier writing a resource management strategy that says let's restore magic, but I think that there is a way to integrate that into the current kind of management and planning frameworks that we have. So the last two slides are actually just a series of quotes from some of the participants in the needs assessment. And I think that a lot of these sum up what we're trying to do. And again, it comes back to kind of working together and learning together on this slide is the takeaway that I get. And not being afraid to make mistakes, I think, is an important thing. And if we're working as a network, as a true collaborative kind of learning from each other, it makes it less daunting to try something, and there's less fear in making a mistake, because that mistake, quote unquote, will help someone else in the future as we're moving together. And then the last slide, I think, is just about trying to take action, doing things. Like, we're at the spot now where the emergency situation is over. We've taken care of the most important things and the life and safety kind of things, and let's move on to taking care of the ecosystems and the landscapes. And how do we do that? But it's going to be a huge challenge. But I think that, this last quote here, this is the window we have to act. And so I think you can interpret that two different ways. Like, it's not going to, we have to do something now, otherwise we're going to, the process are going to further, if they're degrading the landscape, are going to continue to degrade the landscape. And and the other way to interpret that would be to, we're going to have to kind of play the cards we were dealt, I guess. and move on and just solve the problems that we've got, I guess. So that's it for me. I think I can take questions or yeah.
Well, thank you, Collin. That was a great presentation, and I think we can do questions. We can also do, I think, some conversation. It seems like this is a time when the project can use input. So if folks on the phone have sort of suggestions, I think you'd be amenable to that as well?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay. Well, and to start off, John has a comment. Let's see. So he's sort of commenting on the nuances of the moving species around. I don't know, John, is there a point you want to expand on that, or do you want to ask a specific question around that issue?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Actually, I don't. It's just a very interesting thought process on these restoring of ecosystems post-fire events, and given climate change, the whole thing about latitude and versus just moving stuff up the hill or encouraging stuff to move up the hill or realizing that stuff is going to move up the hill with climate change and the elevational models. So it's mostly just a comment that this is one of the things I think about in Sky Island systems in West Texas, or southwestern montane systems in West Texas.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a good comment, and it is one of those things that a lot of people brought it up, and I think a lot of people brought it up when we asked the question, how are you going to deal with these given the likelihood that this area will continue to warm? And a lot of people talked about trying to make sure that any of the outplanting that is done in a way that is in response to, that will be, that will be appropriate for future climate conditions. And so I think that the willingness is there to be able to do this stuff on the Park Service side, at least. The legal piece needs to be worked out in terms of where you can pull seed from and where you can actually put it down. And so I think that still is a discussion that needs to happen. But people were generally supportive of some level of species, of assisted, purposeful species movement. And it's just about bounding that conversation.
Well, and one of the things you said in the presentation about the willingness to make mistakes, and yet no one wants to have made a mistake that was irreversible, and then your name becomes an adjective.
Yeah, totally. And so that's a balance. And I think that there are a lot of people who are really hesitant to go out and do broad scale things, because I think that there's a willingness to make mistakes in the sense that we can do experiments and learn from them, but nobody wants to go out and, plant 400,000 trees or something like that.
Right.
And
right.
We've all kind of lived through that, where you have thinning projects in places that were replanted in the 70s, and so it's generational workload. But we have so when I say make mistakes, I do mean sort of at a really small, kind of small spatial scale.
Well, and that screams for experimentation or experimental plots. That there also is retractability or adaptability back to square one, rather than having created something that has a regret to it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the nice thing about framing them as experiments is that gives you time to talk about, well, what if, scenario plan out a little bit and say, if we get this result, then we'll kind of move forward with the project. Right. But if we get this result, maybe we can do it like what you're saying, and if you planted a bunch of trees and you don't like it, you can cut them down or whatever it is. And so, so I think that, yeah, for sure, it gives you that sense, it gives you the experimentation conversation, allows you to build in adaptive management plans into the kind of land management framework, I guess.
Great, that's a really important conversation. Other comments or questions? The phone line is open, so if you prefer not to type, you can just speak up.
Hi, Collin, this is Pepe. So I had a question about this in terms of so when people are looking at the document you produced, how much of that or what parts of that are applicable to other places? For example, the Gila or the Coronado, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think that and Sasha Stortz, who's on the line, can jump in too if she wants to. But I think that it's one of those things that it is really place specific. So I think that we did this intentionally for it to be an East Jemez place-based project. But I think that you could look at those three overarching kind of categories, the canyon bottom restoration, the tree refugia, and then these areas that have converted from forest into shrubland or grassland. And the ideas that are in each of those sections and the questions that folks have within each of those sections are going to be applicable, at least in the Southwest, in places like the Gila that have had similar kind of disturbances, fire, flood, and drought disturbances. So,
well, but the question to me then is, I agree that those issues are there, but I mean, one of my questions about these big fires is it seems like some places are respond a little bit better than others. So you would have to consider that, right?
No, total, yeah, absolutely, and that's what I'm saying. Is that's why I think it's
so you have to be
in.
Yeah.
It's place. That's why I think it's place specific. But I think you could start with those three kind of overarching issues, and then say, do we have, are we that concerned about the type, the areas that have converted, or should we focus more of our energy on canyon bottoms, or is our system just different, and do we need to think about this differently? And then I think the other thing that's important about this is that the process is important, and so being able to take, the first kind of the methods section and repeat that in different places, that's always going to be really applicable. And that was something that I think we learned during the needs assessment, that it was really important to sit down with people and talk about this and have them share ideas and kind of get the process started of that networking and trying to connect people together.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question about that. So after the needs assessment, I'm just curious with the social and the cultural aspect, if there's a plan in place or tools that you can envision using for a community impact assessment or for the success of the social and cultural aspect of what you're proposing.
That's a good question. Sasha, are you on? Can I punt that to you? Or
I am on. We haven't talked specifically about doing a community impact assessment. The needs assessment, I guess to piggyback on Pepe's question, we used this method of interviewing folks in order to build recommendations on a process for what comes next. And those recommendations included, based on the input from those that we spoke with, identifying a few specific canyons to start collaborative conversations in across boundaries, because most of these canyons are encompassed by a few different jurisdictions, and then to have kind of an overarching group supporting coordination between those efforts, building in opportunities for learning, for field trips, and for creative community engagement. And so that's pretty open-ended right now, and we have our own kind of capacity limitations, but that's sort of the structure that we're currently envisioning in terms of connecting in the community. So a community impact assessment isn't something that we have specifically considered, and I appreciate you bringing that idea up. But yeah, that's the structure that we have in place right now.
Great, thank you. Other questions or comments?
I had this at the beginning, so I had one little question. Is what do you think this how will the responses from the community change over time? You think, like, if you came back and did this in 2031, it would be very different?
Yeah, I hope it would. Yeah, I hope it would be. I mean,
just because, I mean, like, I was in the Catalinas recently, and these people were there, and they said that they lived in Tucson, and so they were kind of admiring all the vegetation and how green it was, but it was actually just an oak shrub field that had burned in 2003. They didn't know it was they just thought it was.
And so we do have that is one of the concerns, is that there is this idea that the baseline is shifting, for the same way that you're describing it. And so part of what we want to do, and this is why the story collection and the cultural piece is so important, is because we actually need the impacts in the East Jemez have been occurring, since the 70s. And a lot of those people are getting to a lot of the people who experience the Jemez in a way that is now impossible to do, are getting to the point where they're old enough that they're getting old, I'll just say that. And and so we're trying to capture that, like, again, it's coming back to this idea of the magic, but trying to capture that sense of place and that feeling, those intangible, those qualitative kind of descriptions of what a place felt like, how did you interact with the place, what did you do there, those kind of things, and not necessarily try to restore any of those specific things, but try to, put together a thing that's reflective of the overall way that the overall kind of sense of place. And it's like, it's complicated, and it's not, obviously this is still in process and not completely well thought out, but yeah, absolutely part of what we're trying to do is push back against that shift in perception of how the landscape looks versus how it did look. And for example, if you drive out to the west side of Bandelier, you look out on the landscape, and that area has burned twice, once in '96 and again in 2011. And on certain hillsides, the visual evidence that place was ever a forest is being wiped off of the landscape. And so we have the ability to go back with photos, with aerial photos, with some data, and say, look, it used to be a forest here, but we don't have those descriptions of what did it feel like out there, what did you do out there, why was it important to go out there, those kind of things. And that's the kind of stuff that we're trying to collect with some of the stories and the art and culture piece.
Well, that's great, Collin. Thank you for, I think that's a almost poetic way to end today's webinar. I want to thank you again for really engaging topic and nice presentation. It's always good to see those photos, even if they're somewhat depressing sometimes. So thank you for sharing those. And thanks to all the participants for joining us today. If you're not on our mailing list, please do join up with the Southwest Fire Science Consortium for other webinars on a wide variety of topics. Not everyone will be interesting to everybody, but we try to add in different kinds of topics. And if there's something that you would be interested in either presenting or seeing presented, please do get in touch. So with that, I'll thank you all and shut down the webinar.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.